There comes a moment in certain people's lives when kindness stops feeling beautiful. Not because they were born cruel, but because the world kept teaching them that compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. Empaths know this pain better than anyone. They are the listeners, the healers, the emotional absorbers who walk through life carrying wounds that were never theirs to begin with. They feel everything deeply. Tension in voices, sadness behind smiles, hidden emotions nobody else notices. And because of that sensitivity, they spend most of their lives trying to protect others from pain while silently drowning in their own. But there is something terrifying that happens when an empath is betrayed too many times. At first, they become exhausted, then distant, then emotionally numb. And eventually, something inside them changes. The warmth disappears first. The endless patience fades next. Then the guilt vanishes. Suddenly, the person who once tolerated everything begins seeing people differently. They stop explaining themselves, stop chasing, stop forgiving instantly. Their silence becomes colder, their intuition sharper, their presence heavier, almost intimidating. People often mistake this transformation for evil, but the truth is darker than that. An empath rarely turns dark overnight. This transformation is usually the result of prolonged emotional trauma, manipulation, betrayal, and psychological exhaustion. It is what happens when someone spends years sacrificing themselves for people who only took from them. And once that emotional switch flips, it almost never fully flips back. Because the most dangerous version of an empath is not the one who feels too much. It is the one who finally learns not to feel at all. The hidden rage. Empaths suppress their entire lives. Most empaths are not naturally peaceful people. They are restrained people. There is a difference. From a young age, many empaths learn that expressing anger makes them too emotional, too sensitive, or too difficult. So instead of releasing emotions naturally, they begin suppressing them. They become experts at swallowing pain in silence, experts at understanding everyone else while abandoning themselves in the process. And over time, this creates something dangerous beneath the surface. Unprocessed rage. Not explosive rage, not loud rage, but a deep psychological resentment that quietly accumulates for years. Because empaths notice everything. They notice disrespect hidden behind jokes, manipulation hidden behind affection, selfishness hidden behind charm. And yet, most of the time, they say nothing. Why? Because they fear conflict. They fear hurting people. They fear becoming the very thing that once hurt them. So they convince themselves to stay patient, to stay understanding, to keep giving people one more chance. But every ignored boundary leaves a scar. Every betrayal they forgive teaches their nervous system that their pain does not matter. Every moment they silence themselves for the comfort of others slowly disconnects them from their authentic emotions. This is why many empaths appear calm on the outside while internally carrying enormous emotional tension. People see kindness and assume weakness. What they do not see is the constant psychological battle happening underneath, the effort it takes to remain gentle in a world that continuously drains them. And eventually, the emotional pressure becomes too heavy to contain. Not because the empath suddenly becomes evil, but because suppressed anger always transforms into something else if it is ignored long enough. Coldness, detachment, emotional withdrawal. The empath begins realizing something painful. Being endlessly understanding did not protect them. It only made toxic people more comfortable disrespecting them. That realization changes everything. Because once an empath stops romanticizing their own suffering, they begin seeing how often their kindness was exploited. And when years of buried rage finally rise to the surface, it can feel terrifying, even to them. Not because they lose their humanity, but because for the first time in their life, they stop prioritizing everyone else's emotions above their own. The betrayal that changes them forever. Empaths can survive pain. What destroys them is betrayal, especially betrayal from the people they loved the hardest. That is the psychological wound most people fail to understand. Empaths do not give people surface-level loyalty. When they care completely. They invest emotionally, mentally, spiritually. They become safe places for others. They listen for hours, forgive endlessly, carry burdens nobody asked them to carry. And because of that, betrayal cuts deeper for them than it does for most people. Not because they are weak, but because they believe the connection was real. There is usually one moment, one specific betrayal, that permanently changes an empath's perception of people. Sometimes it is discovering they were being manipulated by someone they trusted completely. Sometimes it is realizing the person they sacrificed themselves for never truly valued them at all. And sometimes the betrayal is even darker. The empath realizes people were fully aware of their kindness and exploited it anyway. That realization shatters something fundamental inside them. Because empaths often move through life believing that if they love deeply enough, understand enough, forgive enough, they can prevent abandonment or cruelty. But eventually they encounter someone who teaches them the brutal truth. Some people do not heal in the presence of love. They take advantage of it. That is when the empath's worldview begins collapsing. The emotional innocence disappears. The optimism fades. The automatic trust dies. And after enough emotional devastation, the empath stops approaching relationships with openness. They begin approaching people with caution, observation, emotional distance. This is the beginning of the transformation people call dark. But in reality, it is often trauma mixed with awareness. The empath becomes quieter because they are analyzing everything now. They notice inconsistencies faster. Lies become obvious. Fake affection becomes easier to detect. They stop ignoring red flags simply because they want to believe the best in people. And strangely, this new version of them unsettles others. Because toxic people benefited from the old empath, the one who over-explained, over-gave, over-forgave. The transformed empath no longer does that. Now their energy says something different. I see exactly who you are. And for people who once relied on the empath's emotional softness, that shift feels deeply threatening. When compassion begins to die. There is a stage in an empath's transformation that feels almost unreal to them. The moment they stop caring the way they used to, not completely, not instantly, but slowly, emotionally, something begins shutting down inside them. At first, they think they are just tired of explaining their feelings, tired of being the only emotionally available person in the room, tired of constantly giving understanding to people who never offered the same in return. But eventually they realize it is something much deeper than exhaustion. Their compassion is starting to detach from emotion. This is what prolonged emotional pain does to sensitive people. The nervous system can only absorb so much disappointment before it begins protecting itself through numbness. And for empaths, that numbness feels terrifying because empathy has always been part of their identity. It was who they were. The caring one, the patient one, the forgiving one. So when they suddenly stop feeling guilty for distancing themselves, it shocks them. Messages go unanswered. Manipulation no longer triggers emotional panic. Someone cries in front of them, And instead of instantly rushing to fix everything, they simply observe. Not coldly, just detached. This is the stage where many empaths begin feeling misunderstood by everyone around them. People accuse them of changing, becoming too hard, or acting different. But what others fail to realize is that the empath did not become emotionally unavailable without reason. They became emotionally exhausted. Years of emotional labor without reciprocity eventually create psychological burnout. And once burnout reaches a certain level, compassion no longer flows naturally. It becomes selective, guarded, conditional. The empath starts asking questions they never asked before. Who is there for me? Why am I always the one sacrificing? Why do people only value my softness when it benefits them? These questions awaken a painful awareness. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to their heart. And once the empath understands this, their energy changes permanently. They stop overextending themselves emotionally. Stop trying to rescue people who refuse to save themselves. Stop confusing self-destruction with love. To outsiders, this version of the empath may appear colder. But often, this is simply the first version of them that finally understands boundaries. Because compassion without protection eventually becomes emotional suicide. And the empath is finally beginning to realize that constantly bleeding for others does not make someone pure. Sometimes it just makes them easy to consume. The birth of the dark empath. This is the stage where the empath becomes dangerous, not physically, psychologically. Because once emotional innocence disappears, empathy itself changes form. Most people think empathy automatically creates kindness, but that is not entirely true. Empathy is simply the ability to understand emotions deeply. And when someone who understands emotions becomes wounded enough, that emotional intelligence can transform into something much darker. Observation without attachment. Understanding without compassion. The empath begins noticing how predictable people really are. They can read insecurity through body language, sense dishonesty through tone, detect manipulation before a sentence is even finished. But unlike before, they no longer feel obligated to protect others from the consequences of their behavior. This is what creates the dark empath. Someone who still understands emotions deeply, but no longer approaches people with emotional softness. And for many empaths, this transformation feels disturbing at first, because suddenly they realize they know exactly how to influence people if they wanted to. They know what makes people feel validated, insecure, attached, guilty, or emotionally exposed. The same sensitivity that once made them compassionate now gives them an almost surgical understanding of human psychology. The difference is that the wounded empath stops using this awareness only to heal. Now they use it to protect themselves, sometimes to intimidate, sometimes to emotionally detach, sometimes to quietly expose people without saying much at all. Their silence becomes powerful because they are no longer emotionally reactive. They watch more than they speak. And that emotional control unsettles people who once depended on provoking reactions from them. Toxic individuals especially fear this version of the empath, because manipulation stops working on someone who can see the emotional game clearly. The empath no longer chases closure, no longer begs for honesty, no longer explains their worth to people committed to misunderstanding them. And once emotional dependency disappears, the power dynamic changes completely. But this is also the stage where the empath faces a dangerous internal choice. Will they use their awareness to become wiser, or will pain turn them into the very thing they once feared? Because darkness is seductive, when someone has suffered long enough. Emotional detachment can feel empowering after years of being emotionally overwhelmed. And if the empath is not careful, self-protection can slowly evolve into emotional cruelty, disguised as strength. Why people suddenly fear their energy. The strange thing about a transformed empath is that they often become quieter, not louder. And somehow, that silence feels heavier than words ever could. People begin sensing something different about them almost immediately. The empath who once radiated emotional warmth now feels unreadable, controlled, distant. Their energy no longer invites emotional access the way it used to. And this unsettles people deeply. Because most individuals are comfortable around empaths for one reason. Empaths are emotionally safe. They reassure others. They soften tension. They make people feel understood. But once an empath has been pushed beyond their emotional limits, that softness becomes guarded. The constant emotional availability disappears. Now the empath watches before speaking, observes before trusting, analyzes before opening up. Their presence becomes psychologically intense because they are no longer desperately seeking approval or connection from everyone around them. And people can feel that shift instinctively. Conversations become different. The empath no longer overshares emotionally, no longer explains themselves endlessly just to avoid conflict. Their words become shorter, more precise, sometimes almost unnervingly calm. But the most intimidating part is their emotional control. Toxic people often rely on emotional reactions to maintain power. They provoke guilt, fear, confusion, or emotional chaos to keep others psychologically unstable. The old empath was vulnerable to this because they cared too much. They wanted resolution, harmony, emotional repair. The transformed empath no longer reacts the same way. Now they can sit in silence while someone projects anger at them. They can walk away without needing the final word. They can recognize manipulation in real time, without emotionally collapsing under it. That emotional stability feels threatening to people who once relied on controlling them. And suddenly, those same people begin calling the empath cold, intimidating, or hard to read. But what they are actually experiencing is the absence of access. The empath is no longer emotionally exposed. For the first time in their life, they are protecting their inner world instead of handing it freely to everyone who demands it. And because of that, their energy develops a kind of psychological weight, a quiet intensity that makes people think carefully before crossing boundaries. Not because the empath became evil, but because they finally learned that constant emotional openness without protection attracts predators just as much as it attracts love. The dangerous power of emotional detachment. There is a level of emotional freedom that most people never reach, and it begins the moment an empath no longer needs validation to feel valuable. That is the terrifying shift, because for most of their life, the empath's emotions were tied to other people's responses. They felt worthy when appreciated, safe when understood, needed when emotionally useful. Their identity became connected to being emotionally available for everyone around them. But after enough betrayal, something breaks. The empath realizes how dangerous it is to build self-worth around the approval of people who are emotionally inconsistent, manipulative, or selfish. And once that realization fully settles into their mind, emotional dependency begins dying. Slowly, they detach, not from humanity, not from emotions themselves, but from the desperate need to be emotionally chosen by everyone. This changes everything, because emotionally detached empaths become extremely difficult to manipulate. Guilt stops controlling them. Silent treatment loses power, Emotional games become obvious instead of confusing. They stop chasing people who withdraw affection to create control. And for the first time in their life, they begin moving with psychological independence. That independence can feel almost frightening to others. The empath no longer over-explains their boundaries, no longer begs to be understood, no longer sacrifices peace just to maintain connection. If something feels unhealthy, they leave. If someone lies repeatedly, they detach. If respect disappears, access disappears with it. There is no dramatic emotional explosion anymore, only distance. And ironically, this emotional restraint makes the empath more powerful than emotional intensity ever did. Because people lose influence over you the moment your peace becomes more important than their approval. But emotional detachment carries its own danger too. If taken too far, the empath can begin confusing numbness with strength. They may stop trusting entirely, stop opening up completely, stop allowing vulnerability because pain taught them vulnerability was unsafe. And while that emotional armor protects them from manipulation, it can also isolate them from genuine connection. This is the paradox of the transformed empath. The same boundaries that save them can also imprison them emotionally if fear becomes their permanent identity. Because true healing is not becoming incapable of feeling, it is learning how to feel deeply without allowing those feelings to destroy you. And many empaths spend years standing between those two extremes, trying to protect their heart without completely losing it in the process. The final transformation, wise or destructive. Every wounded empath eventually arrives at the same psychological crossroads. One path leads toward wisdom, the other leads toward bitterness. And the difference between the two is almost invisible at first. Because after surviving emotional betrayal, manipulation, abandonment, and exhaustion, the empath finally gains something they never had before: power. The power to detach, the power to read people clearly, the power to stop caring about approval. But power born from pain can evolve in two completely different directions. Some empaths use their suffering to become emotionally mature. They learn boundaries without losing compassion. They become calmer, wiser, more selective about who enters their life. Their empathy remains intact, but now it is balanced with discernment. These are the healed empaths, the ones who understand that protecting their peace does not require punishing the world. They no longer need revenge, because they no longer need validation from the people who hurt them. Their silence becomes peaceful instead of resentful. But not every empath reaches this stage. Some become consumed by the darkness they encountered. Instead of healing, they begin identifying with their pain. They develop superiority complexes rooted in suffering. They stop seeing vulnerability as human and start seeing it as weakness. The emotional wounds that once made them compassionate slowly transform into cynicism, control, emotional manipulation, or quiet cruelty. And the terrifying part is that many of them do not even realize it is happening, because bitterness often disguises itself as strength. The empath tells themselves they are simply protecting their energy, when in reality, they have become emotionally closed off from everyone. They convince themselves nobody deserves trust anymore. Nobody deserves softness anymore. Eventually, they become the very thing they once feared encountering: emotionally unavailable, cold, detached from human connection. This is why the empath's transformation is so psychologically dangerous. Sensitive people do not just feel pain deeply, they absorb it into their identity if they are not careful. And whatever a person repeatedly absorbs, eventually reshapes them. The final evolution of an empath is not about becoming darker. It is about deciding what to do with the darkness they survived. Because pain can create wisdom, or it can create monsters. And sometimes the line between the two is terrifyingly thin. The darkest moment in an empath's life is not when they are hurt. It is when they stop believing kindness is safe. That transformation does not happen overnight. It is built through betrayal, emotional exhaustion, manipulation, and years of giving love to people who only consumed it. Eventually, the empath learns how to survive without emotional attachment. And that survival instinct changes them forever. But darkness is not always evil. Sometimes it is simply the soul learning boundaries after a lifetime of pain. The real challenge is making sure protection does not become bitterness, and wisdom does not become emotional destruction.